read your name in books. This is a real honour, and I feel as if I'm meeting a kind of real life hero in one regard. Every neurofeedback person that I've trained with has mentioned your name. So here you are. You're in my living room.
Well, you can't believe a thing you hear. I pay them all to say these things, you know. No, I've been around since almost the beginning. I started in 1972 and had a laboratory, the first state hospital-based laboratory here in the U.S., probably in the world for that matter. But been involved with it ever since.
So you've been working with EEG since '72?
Yeah.
Goodness.
Yeah, and in the early 90s, I quit counting. We had processed over 500,000 EEGs, and you know, at some point, it doesn't make sense to count anymore. You know? So, you know, we had a laboratory in California, in San Francisco, that did over 100 traditional EEGs every day. Over 100. Some days we bumped into 200 a few times. We had 400 hospitals that sent data over satellite into San Francisco. And we basically processed them out and sent back interpretations. And so I got used to looking at wiggly lines en masse, and also learned artifact as well. You end up having to deal with artifacts since it's not that highly trained individuals in the hospitals. It was usually a respiratory therapist or some ancillary health practitioner that put a cap on somebody and sent the data. And, you know, it takes a little bit of practice to get good at it. And so you know, only rarely did we see somebody put the cap on backwards. So the eye blinks were coming out of the back of the head on the montage we're looking at. But most of the time they did a reasonable job.
Oh, I've done that. I've put it on backwards. I've done that.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, rookie mistakes happen. And one thing I have to say is that I've always learned more solidly from my mistakes. You know, if I do something wrong and I catch it, you know, oh, geez, you know, I did it. You know, you never make that mistake again, you know. But the things you do right, you know, you might repeat them, you know. But the things you do wrong, mistakes really are tough lessons. And especially if you're working in EEG, you know, the mistakes are devastating at times.
Yeah, monumental. Now, with all that experience in reading EEG, for those that are listening, EEG, electroencephalograph, which is a way of measuring the electrical activity in the brain, what do you think a collective consciousness of our planet right now that's in lockdown, if we could take a collective EEG, hypothetically, what do you think it would look like?
Well, I suspect that it's anything but at rest. You know, people may be sequestered at home, but I don't think that they're you know, getting the rest and relaxation that, you know, just a chilled weekend at home might provide. You know, there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of anger. And the anger over that it comes from all sides. It's not just one side or the other that's sequestered that end up being grumpy about it. So you know, I wish there was something you could just wave over the world and make it all well, but this is a pandemic, and they've happened before. The 1918 pandemic in the U.S. was, I think, a tough lesson that if you pay attention to it, learn from the past, there's some lesson to be learned there about not coming out too early from sequester and things like that. So,
and what I really want, this is me now, not the listeners, this is my indulgence, with all this experience of reading brains and reading EEGs, what is consciousness?
Well, you know, it's interesting. You know, that I've presented theories of consciousness, and I view it as an interaction between the mind and the brain. The the brain is represented with neural networks, and neural networks, when you create a network, it has gamma in it. Gamma is a property of having a bound network. And it's not produced anywhere, it's produced everywhere you make a network. So gamma represents the brain function, but the realm of the mind is a different phenomenon entirely. And things like intention, attention, motivation, things that are not observable exterior behavior that you can start to assign, well, that's the realm of the mind as opposed to just a brain function. And those all have correlates with slow cortical potentials. And when slow cortical potentials and gamma interact, consciousness exists. There's actually an FDA registered device that they use for same-day surgeries, and there's a one electrode. It's a big fat electrode, and they say put it on the forehead because there's no hair to get stuck in it. Basically, it's an adhesive electrode. It's 2 electrodes, one in the center, a little insulator, and then an outside ring. So it's a bipolar placement with one spot, and it's used to pick up EEG. And the reason they put it on the forehead is there's no hair. For me, I could probably get back to C3, C4, but they simply look at the relationship between 0.38 hertz, which is infra-low frequency or infra-slow frequency or slow cortical potentials, depending upon where in the world and what group you train with, what they call it. But it's the same signal, below 1 hertz, above usually 1/10 of a hertz, and that's the realm that they're measuring. And 0.38 hertz and 38 hertz. 38 hertz is gamma. It's not gamma 2, but it's gamma. And it's an easy mathematical relationship to look at, 0.38 and 38 hertz. So that's the basis of the bispectral index, the BIS index, which is used, the device that's made by Aspect Medical, that ends up measuring depth of consciousness. And the anesthesiologist gets a number from 0 to 100, and they have to put you at about 60, not below 50, and you'll be fine for surgery. You're so deep you don't move or respond or recall, and you're not so deep that you're going to end up needing to stay in the hospital at night. So same-day surgery, they want to hover you deep enough so there's no problem, but not so deep that you end up having to have a recovery from the anesthesia. And
disappear when you go for, does gamma disappear when you have an anesthetic?
It doesn't disappear, but it becomes unrelated to the infra-low frequency content. There's a phenomenon called nesting, where a low frequency has riding on top of it a fast frequency. And when things are nested, the infra-low frequency goes electronegative and activity is on. When it goes electropositive, activity goes off. That's the normal relationship. And the oscillating EEG is nested in the infra-low frequency. So all of the EEG rhythms basically exist only when the infra-low frequency goes electronegative. You can turn off the brain function by going electropositive, which is what Burbaumer in Europe has done for epilepsy. You train control, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive. And once you get good control, you say, well, for your epilepsy, you need to stay positive. If you feel like you're going to have a seizure and you have an aura go electropositive, you'll turn off the convulsion. And it works very, very well. I mean, they've got a fabulous, strong literature there. So very positive efficacy literature for epilepsy, which, not a lot of people will think you can learn how to not have a seizure if you're an epileptic. 1/3 of all the epileptics are intractable, meaning there's no benefit from meds. They'll be on 3 medications and still be having seizures with no control. So, and neurofeedback can turn those cases around. We have an 82% probability of a 50% or greater reduction in seizure, which in seizure literature, dropping the incidence of seizure by 50% or greater is considered success. Now, I personally consider success no more seizures and no more seizure medication. And we've seen that happen with neurofeedback. People that are on 3 anticonvulsants and are having intractable seizures, end up learning how to control the brain, stop having seizures. The medication being managed independently by the electroencephalographer or epileptologist or neurologist, they don't want you to be on meds any longer than you have to be. So if your EEG is clear and you're not having seizures, they're going to start to slowly take those medications away. And if you stay clear with no more seizures, that you basically walked away from it without the negative consequence of chronic high levels of meds that are tough on your liver and all that kind of thing. So,
absolutely. So if you can train the brain, to no longer have seizures, can you train the brain to have more empathy, to have more love, to have more connection?
I believe that that's possible. In fact, there's a spot on the right temporoparietal junction that is responsible for perceiving social context, facial expressions, body language, the emotional tone of speech. And people that have had trauma, significant trauma, that area ends up turning off to a certain extent. When you're sitting there with your eyes closed, you expect alpha at O1, O2, PZ, fading away as you get further away from that source in the back of the head. When your eyes are closed, your perceptual area should idle. But the intensity in the right temporoparietal junction ends up being an excessive intensity, and that area is essentially turned off. You're not perceiving social context. And for those individuals, they're not really going to get past their problem until they actually wake up that area and have it perceiving and working. And in order for you to move from the loss of empathy, the loss of connection, you have to open that area up. Once you open that area up, you can populate it with experience. And believe me, if you've had somebody that had early life trauma, when you open up the ability to perceive, the first thing they do is misperceive. It's analogous to somebody putting a cochlear implant in. They've never been able to hear, the little kid, they put in the implant, they hear their mother's voice, it's all emotional, everything's great. But the first thing they want to do after its mother's voice is, boy, that's a lot of noise. They want to turn it off. But they have to leave it on to populate the perception with what the richness of the sound is. At first, they think it's just noise, but it's actually the richness of your auditory environment. So they have to leave it on and learn. They have to populate, experience what's coming in. Well, the same thing with emotion. If you open up your emotional eyes for the first time in a long, long time, the first thing you do is your perception is probably not that damn accurate. And it's an opportunity for interactive counseling to end up helping people with that perception. But you have to open up the eyes and get the perception working before any of the experiential re-experiencing of something is going to end up working.
How can we be sure that any perception that we have is accurate?
Only by general consensus. Your perception is your own damn business. Our responsibility, in my way of approaching it, is to make sure the brain is working optimally. If the brain is working optimally, it's up to you what you want to use it for. So, it gets away a little bit from some of the more directive counseling approaches, but once we get the brain working optimally, things tend to go fairly well. Pretty much everybody, if you look, you can find something that's a bit of a deviation that would probably optimize their brain function. But it's silly to think that you don't need a tune-up. Go to Indianapolis 500. There are cars there that their engines cost $200,000, and they tune them up 5 times a day. So a high performance really does require some attention and intervention, not just casual operation. And when you carefully look, you can find little things that you can tweak to optimize function. So very few people end up having spontaneously optimized brain function. You can do a measurement on somebody my age. I'm 70, and you start to actually see the background alpha slowing somewhat, and you could tune that up a little bit, just a little bit faster. In Europe, they did individual alpha frequency plus 1 hertz, and they find that improves semantic and declarative memory. The can't quite find the word, can't quite remember the factoid that you're trying to grab, tip of the tongue experience that happens with seniors. Well, that you can have that tend to go away by a slight tune-up in the background alpha frequency, improve semantic and declarative memory. And it's a nice little phenomenon. You speed up the background alpha. The seniors coined the term brain brightening for the subjective effect. You're literally speeding up the sampling rate perceptually, and a faster sampling rate is higher resolution. So, the colors are sharper, things are crisper, all of those perceptual enhancements are just the tuning of the background alpha. And the semantic and declarative memory are optimized with that. So remembering the factoid that you've got in there that you couldn't quite find, you speed up the alpha a little bit and things are clicking, memory works better.
So if you're able to tune the brain up to subjectively feel brighter, see clearer, hear better, move better, then would I be right to say that then your awareness would increase as well? Because as your subjective experience internally is changing, then your objective experience externally would change. Is that correct?
Assuming you're connected to the outside world. There's a phenomenon called mu in the EEG. It looks like alpha that's kind of sharp and choppy. The wicket rhythm, the wicket fence in England, so when you see, and the letter mu is the same shape, rhythm arceau, rhythm of arcs, if you're French as a neurologist, same thing, and C3 and C4. And that happens when the mirror neuron system isn't engaged with the outside world. So, 15% of the normal population have mu. But 50% of the ADD and depressive population or affective regulatory population have mu. 70% of the autism population have mu. Now, neurologically, mu is normal. I mean, you can't say, oh, there's mu. So what do you have, an AV malformation or a tumor? No. There's nothing neurologically wrong at all. It's a neural network property. If you simply engage with the outside world, the mu goes away. And if you told somebody to intend to move their fingers, the contralateral mu would go away. But you can't see if somebody's really intending. So they basically tell somebody, okay, move your fingers. And when the fingers move, mu goes away. But literally, if you're seeing something in the outside world that you're relating to physically, your mu is blocked. So there are some people that need to be able to turn off the outside world to get into an internal zone. Elite athletes have more mu than the normal population. So mu is not just pathology. It's again, connectedness with the outside world. And you can end up seeing people that are reasonably optimally tuned and functional, but may disconnect from the outside world. And again, for some purposes, it probably is a good skill. For others, it's probably not.
So, as you mentioned, an elite athlete, am I hearing you right when you say that they are more connected to the outside world, that then gives them a capacity to then get into flow in the internal world?
Yeah, you have to be able to turn off the outside world to get into your internal zone in order to compete at an elite level. Elite athletes aren't normal. They're an outlier, and you wouldn't expect them to be normal. Now, you'd expect them to generally be healthy, but not always normal. Gerard Finnemore in South Africa did a study on some ultra athletes, people that row across the Atlantic Ocean in a little single boat, ultra marathoners, people that run forever out in the middle of nowhere in the wilderness and stuff. And these people have usually an OCD type marker in the brain. If they didn't have a bit of an obsession, they probably wouldn't be doing what they're doing. So for their specific application, they've got a brain that's tuned for what they're doing. Now, if you're an ultra marathoner and you no longer are of an age where you can compete, if you don't have control over that obsessive compulsive anterior cingulate, then maybe you need some training to unlock your focus. But having your ability to lock your focus onto something can end up being a useful thing as well. Business executives tend to have a slight, not a pathological level of, but a slight obsessive compulsive trait, and also a slight trait for impulsivity. That they can't be pathologically impulsive, but they have to be ready to pull the trigger in a business deal, because if you're not the first one, you probably didn't get the deal. So in elite business executives, they screen for a subtle OCD. You've got an 80-hour week doesn't come easy, so, for that kind of a business executive, they figure 3 to 5 years is all they've really got from them. And, they can deal with their pathology later, or they're a golden parachute. I've actually worked with a CEO candidate screening company for Fortune 500 companies. And they were looking at whether they wanted to do EEG assessments or not, and they were kind of going for it, but their marketing people said it looked too much like a lie detector test to them. They didn't think it was good for their marketing, so they chose not to use it. But it gave some interesting insights into what people are looking for in elite athletes and business executives.
And also, there's I don't know if you're aware of him over here. There's a guy that's kind of taken the world by storm with ice bathing and breathing. A guy called Wim Hof. He's called the Iceman. Have you heard of Wim?
No, I haven't heard of him, but I grew up in North Dakota, and we went under the ice in Minnesota, Polar Bear Club and all that. So I'm not unfamiliar with doing stupid things, They're
prophesizing that it's curing PTSD, it's curing depression, it's curing all these things, yet there's no entrainment in it. So I'm curious if you could shine some light on what going into cold water for 5 minutes every day would change the signature of post-traumatic stress in the brain.
I know for some people it might be a brand new stressor. Ice water is also a stressor unto itself. The cold pressor test, if you're familiar with that, you plunge your arm into ice water, and if you're not used to doing it, it becomes rather disturbing rather quickly. It's not just cold; it's painfully cold. And quite often people feel like it's burning cold, and it's distressing, and people pull their arm out, leaving it in sometimes only for seconds. But if you turn off your sensation of pain, you can end up tolerating that really quite well. But it requires you to basically turn off your focus on it. So it may require, if you did it on a daily basis, it may require a total change in your attentional network.
Your attentional network, right?
Yeah, I worked at the state hospital in 1972. One of our first patients, we did a physiological profile on people, and one of our first patients was a young woman from the adolescent ward, and she was severely depressed. And we measured her EMG in the forearm extensor is the most voluntary muscle in the body. And we hooked that up just to get a baseline of what your forearm extensor level of tension was peripherally. And her tension level was pegging high and then going down to virtually nothing, high and low, high and low. And we said, "Can you feel that?" And she said, "No, I don't know why that's doing that." And we thought, well, maybe it's the meter. We swapped out to a different EMG unit, and sure enough, same thing. But she said she couldn't feel it, and I had to believe her. She seemed really quite, earnest that she couldn't feel it. And we started to look into how somebody could not feel something. And we brought her back in for other measurements because in the 1950s, there was some work that was done on peripheral glucose uptake and depression. And, one person who's depressed, another person who's not, same amount of intake, and the depressive person gains the weight. Well, there was a peripheral decrease in glucose uptake. And we measured her peripherally for the acupuncture points, which are electrically negative hotspots. And hers were electropositive with respect to a neutral reference point. So they're electrically hot negatively by metabolic function. So we figured this was hypometabolic in some fashion. It matched up with the glucose stuff. Now, she couldn't feel things. Now, I just happened to have cut those 4 fingers off once and had them put back on. And this is in North Dakota now. And North Dakota is minus 40 degrees, which is the same Celsius and Fahrenheit. Minus 40 is brutally cold no matter what kind of temperature you're measuring. It's just absolutely terrible. And you know what reattached fingers feel like at minus 40? It's like putting your hand in a vise and squeezing it. It was really, really quite painful. And here I have a patient that can't feel something. I want some of that. So I figured we have, what do we see? Well, electrically negative acupuncture points, and you can hook yourself up and measure the intensity. If you move a couple of millimeters, you lose the electrical intensity, but you can measure the intensity of the acupuncture points. And I simply turned down the electronegativity to the point where the pain was gone. And I learned to warm my hands because temperature training was really popular in the early 70s. That was one of the big.
So biofeedback, temperature regulation.
Yep. And I used an Offner T-type EEG device that could measure down to DC. So I had an actual DC measurement. And it's just that you end up with the electrodes you have to construct your own electrodes. You can't put a big electrode onto your acupuncture point, which is only the size of a pinhead, So, with a little bit of an adaptation, we basically used it for feedback. And I learned how to turn off the pain. Now, years later, I'm standing at a meeting and up comes a physician who I've known for maybe 15 years by that point. And he says, I hear this story that you learned how to not feel pain and, your severed fingers, blah, 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 And I said, yeah, I'll verify the story. And you could tell he had this little seed of doubt in the back of his mind somewhere. And this is a conference, and there's a big bin next to me full of sodas in ice water. So I stuck my arm up to the elbow down into the ice water, and I stood there and talked to him for another 5 minutes. And finally he said, "Oh, Jay, take your arm out of the ice water. I can tell you're not in any kind of distress, cold pressor test. You passed your cold pressor test better than I've ever seen anybody pass it." And I, dried my hand off but it's just straight pathophysiology of pain. And, you can turn down pain. You literally can turn down pain effectively. The literature on electrical negativity is that if you measure the hand's electronegativity, you can predict whether somebody's going to feel the pinprick, whether they've been hypnotized to not feel it, general anesthesia to not feel it, a blockade in the brachial branch of the nerve to block the pain. However you turned off the pain, that you can predict that they're not going to feel the pinprick by the electronegativity. So it was just something that could be trained. I'm not going to be testing myself with a pin, poking myself hard. But years later, we ran into Kawakami, who's an expert at Kundalini yoga, and he came over from Japan over to Hasselt, Belgium, to a BFE meeting. And Eric Pepper had it set up that they were going to end up doing a skewer, a barbecue skewer stick through his neck and through his tongue. And they had thought technology equipment all hooked up to project onto the wall behind him. And I had seen his full QEEG previously, and I knew the trick that he did basically was to go electropositive on the somatosensory strip and turn off sensation. And electronegative is on, electropositive is suppressed or off. And he simply turned off the sensation, does the stick, and then turns back on sensation. Once you've got something stuck in you, if you've ever had an IV, getting it stuck in, the prick is not comfortable, but once it's in there, you can tolerate that without too much difficulty. So he skewers through his neck and skewers through his tongue, and then turns back on the somatosensory strip. So you could see on the wall behind him all the muscle, all the electrodermal, everything that they could measure, temperature, you name it. EEG, one channel. I just had to tell him where to place it because he does a stick from the right side and end up seeing left side somatosensory strip. If you only have one channel, that's where to put it. And the EEG spectra is dancing, and all of a sudden the low frequency end of the spectra drops down, all the EEG drops down. He does the stick, back comes up the EEG. So you could see how he did his control. And it's using the slow cortical potential to turn off the brain's electrical activity. And that's the mind operating the brain, So
my question leading in from that, Jay, would be: we've now been in a lockdown situation, a trauma situation, PTSD. When you normally hear the acronym PTSD, we immediately think of war and soldiers coming back from Afghanistan or Iraq. But right now we're in an incubator where I'm looking towards the future of this bringing people out with PTSD-like symptoms.
Yeah.
Okay.
I suspect that that's probably going to be the case for some people. But, let's look at PTSD a moment. Traditionally, they look at kind of war zone kind of things as good indicators that there was trauma. So they went into Israel, and there was a kibbutz of some sort that had a trauma event, a terrorist event, and everybody was traumatized at the time. But PTSD isn't trauma at the time. It's trauma that lasts more than 6 months. So 6 months later, they test everybody, and pretty much everybody at that point was still pretty badly traumatized. And they then came in a year later. 60% of the people had no longer any trauma indicated. Then they figured, well, wait another 6 months or a year and it'll just keep dropping down. But the 40% who didn't recover just didn't recover. They stayed traumatized. Now, what's the difference between the group that recovered? Because trauma's trauma, and everybody's going to have some negative experience with it. How do you recover from it? What's the seed of resilience that's going to allow you to walk away from the trauma without being traumatized from it? And what they found is that the people who don't recover had a high arousal level. So PTSD is complex stuff, but let's think of the simple model of a phobia. I had a high arousal level. I saw a spider. I freaked the hell out. Now I'm a phobic about spiders. I see something dangling. I'm my hair rises on my arms and I freak out. I scream and run away or whatever. So you've got somebody who's got a true phobia about spiders or heights or snakes or. whatever it is, if you're a therapist, you want to end up having a hierarchy of things that are successively a little bit more like the thing that they're traumatized by. But the first thing you do in therapy is to drop their arousal level. If you don't drop the arousal level, you can't show somebody fuzzy dice. They're going to see spider. You got to drop their arousal level and then show them the progressive hierarchy of things. As long as they keep their arousal level down, they're slowly detaching from their trauma. Well, PTSD, the people who stayed traumatized from the PTSD were the people that had a high arousal level. So who has a high arousal level? Fast alpha and beta spindles in the cortex, both of which are sometimes high performance features. The beta spindles and elite athletes and business executives. It's a good thing there. But if you have trauma and you have those markers, you have to learn how to deal with it. Otherwise, you'll be stuck with your trauma. You've got to learn how to drop your arousal level. And once you learn how to drop your arousal level, you might have to have a specialized hierarchy set up. But, those people who had a lower arousal level didn't go through therapy to get rid of their trauma. They lived their life. So if you learn to drop your arousal level and control your inner state, you can decouple from the trauma. It takes time and experience, and therapy probably helps. But living your life, if you learn how to control your arousal level, living your life will decouple you from a lot of things. And the alpha theta approach with PTSD teaches people hypoperfusion of the brain, and that's the brain at rest. John Griselier.
Am I allowed to say I am a bit addicted to alpha theta training? Am I allowed to say that?
Well, John Griselier did alpha theta training with musicians and folks, and not with a PTSD group, but musicians. And the alpha theta there enhanced their creativity. But he did a QEEG on them before and after, and he found that the alpha theta training in normal people didn't increase their alpha, didn't change their alpha or theta. It decreased beta. Beta is hyperperfusion. And, if you had beta, you now controlled your beta because you learned hypoperfusion. So the hyperperfusion was treated. And performance anxiety tends to go away because of that. So for a musician, it's a good thing. And they were already good musicians at the Conservatoire of Music. I mean, it's like going to Juilliard. You don't find a bad musician at Juilliard. You find some extraordinary and some not quite as extraordinary, but they're all damn good,
So talking about trauma, we're seeing there's an increase of plant medicines now in the field of therapy that we're working with. We're working with clients that are using ayahuasca, or they're using psilocybin, etc., etc., etc. So, what would you then? What would you see? How is the plant medicine helping heal the trauma? If what you're saying from an EEG is it's actually not dealing with the trauma, it's dealing with the arousal level. So you don't focus your indication on the trauma, you focus on decreasing the client's arousal level. So how is the plant medicines that people are moving towards today assisting in healing the trauma, the PTSD?
Well, the ones that I've seen are more commonly used here for depression. Ketamine has regulatory approval. It's not as it's not ubiquitous. You don't walk into anybody's office and get ketamine. It's still a kind of a specialty office that does that, especially the infusion. I mean, as a psychologist, you don't necessarily learn how to give injections, so you end up having people with some specialty training to end up running an infusion clinic. But what we find basically is that there's a marker for the people that are going to respond well to the ketamine, especially ketamine combined with TMS, which is actually a patented protocol, but the patent's no good. So feel free to do ketamine and TMS together without paying anybody a royalty for it, But the ketamine basically gives you a rostral anterior cingulate theta increase, but afterwards there's a reduction. We see a biomarker that looks like it's the marker for somebody that's likely to respond with anterior cingulate theta. But it's not just theta, it's slowed alpha combined with gamma. It's a thalamocortical dysrhythmia. In depression, a thalamocortical dysrhythmia is present at the rostral anterior cingulate. This was actually work by Dirk de Ridder, MD, PhD, neurosurgeon, and he finds thalamocortical dysrhythmia and tinnitus, and he had an algorithm set up, a machine learning algorithm set up to identify tinnitus versus normal. And sure enough, it works really, really well if you have normal versus tinnitus. But one day into his office comes somebody who was in the normal group, and it says tinnitus. And he says, I don't have tinnitus. Well, what's going on? Well, I have chronic pain. Well, it turns out that tinnitus gives you thalamocortical dysrhythmia in the auditory cortex. Chronic pain gives it to you in the somatosensory cortex. Parkinsonism gives it to you in the motor regulatory areas frontally. And in depression, rostral anterior cingulate. Same kind of a failure in a different neural network. So if you have a thalamocortical alpha column that slows down to the theta frequency, at that point, the lateral inhibition at a cortical location is turned off, and gamma surrounds the area and moves in. And in tinnitus, you've lost a frequency. You've too much loud music, rock and roll, power tools, whatever it was. And once you lose a frequency, that cortical fiber going up to that frequency location tonotopically in your auditory cortex is lost. So the alpha on that column slows down to about 6, and then the gamma invades. The gamma is linearly related to the tinnitus, how loud the sound is that you hear. And it's neuroplasticity, just like chronic pain from an amputation, where it's neuroplasticity gone awry. If I touch my face, now I feel it in the stump of my arm that was missing. It's because the sensation from this area has now invaded the arm area. And the gamma is linearly related to that invasion. And Dirk is a sharp guy. He's a neurosurgeon, and if you've lost an input from hearing, or you've lost the input from losing a limb, he can put an implant in over the area of the cortex and turn it on and replace the input from the outside instead of from the inside, and turn off the tinnitus or turn off the phantom pain. Now, movement disorders, they've got other places to stick electrodes if you've got a movement disorder, Parkinson and so forth. But depression, now they're just starting to look at that, and rather than go in with and stick, neurosurgeon and stick a device in there to stimulate it, we can teach you how to operate that same area. You don't necessarily have to have a neurosurgeon stick a stimulator in there to end up changing the function in the area of depression. And the neuromodulatory approach if you've got a neuron and you want to control the neuron, you got 2 ways to grab onto it. You can grab onto a ligand-gated ion channel, which is a medication like ketamine. You grab onto the neuron with ketamine, but you can also grab onto the neuron with voltage-gated ion channels. Ligand-gated or voltage-gated ion channels, one or the other, or both. And if you give somebody ketamine, it's a dissociative. I mean, they can do dental surgery on it. So you can turn up the TMS coil intensity a little more than you normally would, because it's a little uncomfortable when you turn it up. But if you're on ketamine, you can turn it up a bit, So they blast the area with TMS and ketamine, and there's a pretty solid rate of recovery. It has a strong efficacy. And if it is effective, it's not like you come out of the session and say, well, I'm 10% better. Let's do 9 more sessions and I think I'll be there. It flips a switch, and it's a change in kind. It's not a percent incremental improvement. It's either you got it or you didn't get it. And again, the thing that we see that tends to predict who's going to have a response is the dysrhythmia. If you have a thalamocortical dysrhythmia at the front of the cingulate and you're depressed, we see that theta marker in the spectra, and we look at the component analysis with independent component analysis, and you see that the theta and the gamma are cross-spectrally linked within the same component. You have a dysrhythmia, and that's like painting a big target right on top of that area. Man, we are going to hit that with ketamine and TMS pulse and have a high probability of success. And anytime you can increase your probability of success with a little pre-test, it saves somebody the uncomfortable nature of ketamine experience if it's not going to be of any good. It's not everybody enjoys the trippy experience of ketamine. Some people have distress with alterations of their consciousness.
So people right now that are in lockdown, Jay, that can't access neurofeedback and can't access ketamine or ayahuasca, what would be your suggestions? Just, I know we're running out of time here, but what would your suggestions be for people that are living in lockdown? What would be your recommendation for people to manage this situation with all the brains that you've scanned and how you see we react to our environment?
Sure. Number one is to try to cut down on the input from outside of you. It's tempting to turn on the TV and see how horrible it is today, but it's horrible, and if you focus on that, it is probably not beneficial for your arousal level. And if you're going to try to learn how to drop your arousal level, you may have to trim down some on the input end of things to keep from being jacked up from the arousal of an input. Secondly, you do have control of your internal state. And one of the easiest ways to grab onto that control is one of the most common things. If you go to a bunch of different meditative traditions, one of the common things they say is follow your breath.
Absolutely.
And heart rate variability is basically paced breathing with lots of hardware to measure it. So if there's sympathetic and parasympathetic balance pieces associated with it and everything. But paced breathing can be done without any fancy training. I had a good friend from the United States who wanted to go over and work with the Syrian refugees in France, and apparently a huge number of people. And she was wanting advice on what EEG device to bring over. And I said, well, quite honestly, if you go over and you have an EEG device, you can fix one person at a time. And they can't turn around and fix the next person because it takes an EEG device and specialized training and everything. But if you have inexpensive little heart rate variability deals that help pace breathing, they can teach somebody else to pace the breathing. I mean, if you can teach 10, you can teach 1,000. So, don't go over with a high tech approach. Go over with a low tech approach, and be effective. Now, you can bring along your EEG device for the rare person that might have an unexpected response to it. Slow breathing and they start to have a convulsion or something, you might want to look and see whether they've got epileptiform discharges in their EEG. So, bring your EEG device, but don't use it as a common therapy tool because you'd limit your effect to a handful of people while you're there instead of affecting 1,000. So, and,
learn to breathe.
Yeah, learning to breathe properly, the right pace, the right amount of inhale, the right amount of exhale, a little faster inhale, a little slower exhale. 6 breaths a minute generally is going to be about right. But everybody's a bit different. And if you've got the ability to assess it with the fancy devices, you're going to be able to customize their breathing rate. Some people do 5 better than 6. Some people, because of their physiological circumstance, might do better at 7 than 6. So, but 6 is generally about right. And if all you've got is the ability to look at your watch every 10 seconds, have a cycle, 6 breaths in a minute. So, breathe in for 4, exhale for 6, and you've got yourself a 10-second cycle. And you might have to do a couple of cleansing breaths to kind of get into get in to be ready for it. People tend to, under anxious, tense circumstances, have faster, shallower breathing, which builds up CO2. You'd think, well, I'm breathing as fast as I can. How can I have extra CO2? Well, you're not breathing deep. So the bottom half of your lung, which is you're just going panting on the upper half of your lung, and the bottom half of your lungs holding all this extra CO2. If you and I were sitting in a room and some obnoxious scientist in the other room turned up the CO2 level, left our oxygen just fine, but just turned up the CO2 level in the room, we'd start to get flush. Our blood vessels would tend to open up a little bit, and we still have plenty of oxygen. It's not like we're going hypoxic or anything, but eventually we would have a freaking panic. It's without exception. I mean, it's normal physiological system. With enough CO2, you're going to have a panic. Your body is saying, there's something really wrong here. You could die. And at a primal level, that signal is going to happen. And if you don't know what it is and your body tells you you're about to die, you look around, I don't know what, but I'm anxious about whatever the hell it is. So you can have a generalized anxiety disorder just because of bad breathing practice.
Absolutely.
And if you breathe fast and shallow, you're going to have enough CO2 to end up with a panic. And learn to pace your breathing, slow it down. One thing you have good voluntary control over when you pay attention to it is your breathing. Who's telling you to breathe? Well, you are at an unconscious level or at a conscious level. If you can consciously intervene and slow it down, get your blood oxygen and all of the end tidal CO2 levels and everything balanced out properly. What was that I was anxious about again? Oh, yeah. My body was telling me I was about to die, but I'm not. So I'm fine. So your body will get past the unknowing, whatever the hell it is that's about to kill me, signal that it sends you that makes you, irrationally anxious. So if you have a normal reason to be anxious, you can help deal with it by going into the paced breathing and balancing out your sympathetic and parasympathetic balance. Overly anxious people have a high sympathetic arousal level. They don't balance sympathetic, parasympathetic, and proper breathing balances that. So, and it gives you good heart rate variability. And heart rate variability, you'd think, well, you want a nice steady heartbeat. No, you don't. You want a heart rate that speeds up when you breathe it in and slows down when you breathe it out. And that flexing of the heart rate is actually a strength. That's resilience. And people that have no heart rate variability have an impending cardiac failure. It's a marker for impending cardiac failure. So breathe in, a little faster, breathe out slow and deep, and do it nice and slow, 10-second cycles approximately, and you're going to end up winding down the over arousal. And it sounds too simple, or how could it work? Well, half the solutions in life are actually simple solutions that you just need to. Here's the crank, keep turning it. And this is a simple crank to turn. It doesn't have to be high tech. It can be. I mean, you can have all sorts of heart rate variability monitors. I'm wearing an Oura ring, which monitors heart rate variability and temperature and sleep and things like that. There's lots of higher tech levels of things with computers that do spectral analysis and everything. So, feel free to go high tech if you feel like it. But this is also one that strips down to, au natural with no hardware whatsoever, just fine.
Jay, it's been an absolute pleasure. It has. I could talk to you all night, and everything that everybody said about you is so true. You just get hypnotized by you. You just get pulled in, and you've made me want to learn again. So that's fantastic. And I hope this isn't the first and last time we speak. So I'm sending you all my blessings from Scotland, and I hope that you're doing good over there.
Well, I'm staying happy. It might be an unreasonable happiness, but I'll hold on to it anyway. So.
Oh, God bless. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us tonight, Jay. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure, and believe me, I could stay on and talk for the next 3 days. So
it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. Have a great night.